everybody. Welcome back to CMN 153, and this is for our class for Thursday, the 23rd, where we are talking about the internet, which means we are talking about artificial intelligence. And if you've been watching the news, we are in a very interesting place right now because a couple of days ago, OpenAI acted on its own and it hacked into another system known as Hugging Face. It's a digital library of AI technology that's used by developers. But the more interesting piece is that AI was acting on its own independently, and there is no real explanation as to how that could have happened. So now there's all kinds of questions, as there have been in the past, but they've certainly come to the forefront about guardrails. So I find that to be quite interesting. And that said, the internet is more than AI. And in fact, I remember the world before there was an internet in the way that we think of it. And it was different. And I'm not saying that it was better or worse. It was different. It definitely had its positives, it definitely had its negatives. But from personal experience, I can say, because I grew up as a teenager without the internet, there seemed to be a lot more social interaction, just face to face talking, that seems to be lacking now amongst the same demographic. There was also, I think, a need to work to get information, and there's something that's positive about that. I think that sometimes if something is too accessible and it's too easy, we oftentimes don't take the kind of care that we need to take to evaluate what it is that we have. And as many of you put in your discussion form responses, that you feel that misinformation is perhaps the biggest issue that's facing mass media today. So, I wanted to talk a little bit about the internet, and I also wanted to talk a little bit about your journals because your first journal will be coming up soon, and it'll be based on the internet. Now, that said, certainly we've talked about topics that have not necessarily directly addressed the internet. We've talked about advertising and marketing, and we've also talked about media studies, and certainly you can incorporate some of those elements in there. But my thinking is that what we are discussing about um, media really begins today with our discussion of the internet. And I had initially, when I put together this class, basically put things in a chronological order as much as possible. And of course, the internet would not be chronological order, but I put it first because the internet has basically changed all the other media forms. It's known as media convergence. So it seems to make a certain level of sense. And what I'm thinking about for the journals is that you've got a page of reflections about the topic, which for us is about internet. And certainly you can focus on something like artificial intelligence, or you can make it much more broad. You can talk about some of what I'm going to be discussing in the class video, some of what the textbook discusses, or your own thoughts and impressions about the subject as well. Wanted to be pretty open ended. And that said, I'm expecting about a page or so, but as long or as short as you think it needs to be. I'm not evaluating it for grammar or mechanics. I'm basically for content. You can think of it as a kind of diary, but rather than writing about your personal life, you are writing about a specific subject, though certainly you can relate that subject to your personal life. And that journal is going to be our first journal due the 28th. So that's Tuesday. Certainly, if you need an extension, let me know, and I'll be happy to grant it to you. And from now on, you basically will have journals due on the previous classes topics so that by the ending of the semester, you've basically got a running catalog of your thoughts and reflections and my responses about the topics at hand that could help you with the final project, which we will talk more about as the semester progresses, where you get to focus on a specific element of media. Or this could also help you with the final exam, which is an essay exam, but it's open book, open notes so that you can utilize things like your journals. So that said, I ask that you send your journals to me via PDF because that's how my grading program works best, to my email, which is ruiz, Ruiz, at www.mass.edu. And again, that first journal will be on internet, social media, artificial intelligence. That's the name of the chapter in the textbook. And that'll be due Tuesday, the 28th. So, some of the points that I wanted to cover about the internet: its creation, its history, it's a linked, decentralized gatekeeping or gatekeeper network of phones and cables, satellites that carry digital, and it's uncensored, which is both good and bad, digital information worldwide for either two-way communication or one-to-many communications. So it's a way to link lots of different vehicles of media. In the 90s, which is when I started teaching at GCC, we talked about it being the information superhighway, that it was a place for a storehouse, in effect, for information. But of course, it's become so much more since then. It started as a military project, which I find ironic, a government project, because one of the most decentralized things in our existence really was created through one of the most centralized things, the internet being decentralized and the government being very centralized. Began as a military project in the 1960s, something called Advanced Research Projects Agency, ARPA, for military and academic communications. And email was electronic mail at the time that academic communications relied upon. And of course, there's lots of different communications now. And the use of microprocessors, miniature circuits, changed the game so that ultimately computers could be smaller and smaller and be more portable. Also, what changed the game were fiber optic cables, glass rather than metal wires, so more information could be sent more quickly. Initially, it was a read-only to a read-write multimedia, and then we see how it expanded to something called the World Wide Web, which led to hypertext. And hypertext is just a way to link data systems. This was done in the 1980s by Tim Berners-Lee at CERN. It's a European organization for nuclear research in Switzerland. He was a software engineer. I, in fact, have a brief video for you to watch with his reflections about what happened with his World Wide Web invention, which he made free for the good of humanity, by the way. And web browsers, of course, were necessary at that point, software that would navigate the web. Again, I am old enough to remember when I actually purchased a book that listed all of the websites in existence in the 90s. It sounds absurd, but it's true. Obviously, now they're expanding exponentially. The first major internet service provider, which was also my service provider, AOL, America Online, and this was before broadband, so we had to use the phone lines. And then ultimately, what we see is now how things have expanded to the point where phone internet is really unacceptable in terms of what is expected in our society nowadays. We've got the Internet of Things. We've got, in 2022, of course, the introduction of ChatGPT and OpenAI, generative artificial intelligence. In between all of that, well, little things like Amazon, you might be familiar with, Facebook, you might be familiar with, and the big five, as they're known: Apple, Amazon, Facebook, Microsoft, and Google. You probably know the names of the individuals: Bill Gates, Steve Jobs, Jeff Bezos, Mark Zuckerberg, Elon Musk. Of course, we can add Sam Altman from ChatGPT. An important date that we will be revisiting over and over again in terms of media studies is 1996. This is when the Telecommunications Act removed regulation restrictions in telecommunications. This is huge because it basically allowed for things like monopolies. It allowed for things like domination of media outlets, which we will discuss. So, what is digital communication? It's just images and sounds that are electronically converted into binary numbers, ones and zeros. And social networks, they began with something called a blog, and I used to have a blog, a digital content that would be posted in chronological order. Wikis, probably Wikipedia is still a major player, collaborative website content. Virtual worlds, interactive 3D digital environments, and of course, social media, digital platforms encouraging users to create content. And the idea of the new or the newer part of the internet is that we weren't just absorbing content, we were creating content. So much so that now we even have the name, a creator. And 90 plus percent of internet users, according to studies, are involved with one kind at least of social media, if not many. And I've talked about convergence, the technological merging of mass media content. We talk about things like the digital divide, the disparity between those that do have digital access and those that don't. I suspect that this will become more prominent with those who have access to more sophisticated AI programs. Right now, the biggest issue with digital divides happens to be with high speed internet and broadband. There is a concept of net neutrality that every website and user should have the same internet access and speed. That has come under question multiple times as larger corporations with more economic and political power have argued that their speed should be increased. And of course, we know how mobile devices, I'm actually recording on a mobile device, handheld computers, we call them phones. Ironically, we rarely use the function of the phone to make a phone call. Some of the many issues to consider in terms of the internet. Addiction, and social media was created by design to be addictive. Lots of psychology. The Pavlovian dog experiments, if you know them, were used with social media. Every time you get a like, every time you get a little ding from your phone, I mean, there is a physical response. Walled gardens that you can access information only through some sort of a paywall. Journalism made some huge mistakes, as we will talk about with the internet, by giving away free content. And then basically the public expected it for free, and they realized that this would be the ending of their industry if they could no longer generate profit from their content. So some of them have instituted these paywalls. New York Times is one example, for instance. Certainly, we've all struggled with privacy issues with the internet. I was reading a very interesting article going back to how this generation interacts so differently than my generation did during adolescence, and that part of it is the current fear that one will be recorded and exposed on the internet. So, one action, one mistake could basically follow you through a lifetime. I thought it was a very interesting idea that I had never truly considered. We've got, of course, phishing, email, internet identity theft issues. We've got spyware, secret information gathering software. Isn't it interesting that the AI breach happened to be about a kind of hacking or spying? We've got data mining, data collecting systems, so that ultimately individuals have no longer the kind of privacy that they used to expect, and also marketers and advertisers have an incredible amount of information on us so that they can direct specific products or specific issues to us. Cookies, the automatic collection and transfer of information profiles. If I'm correct, I think in order to get onto the GCC website, you have to go through a screen about whether or not you will accept cookies. Not only do we have misinformation, false and misleading information thought to be true, disinformation, false, misleading information spread with malicious intent. So you can weaponize information. If you've never read the book 1984 by George Orwell, I highly recommend it because many of these issues were discussed in that particular text. And we'll talk about this text a little bit more when we get to the book section. Obviously, we've got sexting issues, cyberbullying issues, lots of polarization, deep fakes, filter bubbles, just a few, and government control. And I've got an article for you to read. It's short, in the number 7 below for the internet section. And it's about The Late Show with Stephen Colbert. So if you happen to follow the news, you are probably already aware that his show was canceled in part because of government being concerned about the way that he was presenting government in his comedy monologues. So we've got certainly lots of issues to discuss, and think about just video conferencing, Zoom, and how the world changed after COVID. And it's one of the reasons why this class is communicated in the way that it is. I hadn't taught online prior to COVID. I didn't want to teach online, but it's probably part of the world now, whether we like it or not. So I have some things for you to watch, so I'm going to keep this short today. And this is in the third section in the notes below, where you could see that I wanted you to watch a 1-minute commercial that was quite famous. The 1984 Macintosh computer TV commercial. Why was it so famous? Well, it was playing off of the idea of that book I mentioned, 1984, which was written prior to 1984. It was a futuristic dystopian novel about government control. So in 1984, and at that point I was a teenager, everybody was talking about that particular book and the way that we were similar and different from that time period. But the advertising for that particular product was brilliant, twofold. First, it appeared during the Super Bowl. You've got an incredibly large audience, and it was shown once and only once during that Super Bowl. Now, this was a time period where you couldn't stream. Very few people were recording television programs. So chances are either if you didn't see the ad live, then you might have it on video, but more likely than not, you just missed it and you only know about it through word of mouth. And the word of mouth spread like wildfire. Everybody wanted to know about this new product, this thing that was not even described in the ad. We know that the Macintosh computer was going to be changing things, but we didn't know specifically what a Macintosh computer was and how it would change things. So I started college, by the way, in 1985. So I was first introduced to the Macintosh computer in my freshman year in 1985. And I've been using Macintosh computers since. I will use IBMs, but I have a preference for Macintosh. This is what I first learned on, which goes to show the strength of brand loyalty, I suppose. Another video that I want you to see, this is a 10-minute video from Macworld Expo in 2007, and it's also related to Macintosh. It was the introduction of the iPhone. So this is Steve Jobs talking about this incredibly new invention that would combine all these media forms. And the iPhone changed the world because then smartphones basically were becoming part of the daily life of the majority, whether you're using that particular brand or another brand. And yes, I am using the iPhone, I must say. So that video I was talking about from Tim Berners-Lee, the creator of the World Wide Web, this was done in 2018, and it's 6 minutes long. It's a TV program interview where he's talking about being devastated by the way the World Wide Web has been misused, where he had made it free for the good of humanity, and he had a very different vision for it. It would be for the sharing of information, not necessarily for what it exists as today. A wonderful documentary that I want you to watch, and it's 58 minutes long, so I'm going to leave you with watching this documentary, and this is in the 5th section before. The Extraordinary Story of Artificial Intelligence. It does a really good job of telling you what artificial intelligence is and how it developed. And I'm well aware that it's dated. So you have to keep that in mind that this is in 2018. If you want something recent, I can recommend something recent. I can't find a link for it free online, though if you can, certainly send me the link and I'll be happy to share it with everyone. It was done in March of 2026. What I was able to do was to share the trailer with you, which I recommend that you watch. The trailer is 3 minutes long, and it is called the AI documentary, or How I Became an Apocalyptimist. So they made up a word there. And it's been called perhaps the most important documentary of our time. And I agree. I don't think that's hyperbole, because some of the issues that are facing us right now in terms of artificial intelligence are the issues that will shape humanity. So it's no understatement to say that this is our industrial revolution, but it is much faster and much more prolific than anything that occurred during the industrial revolution. So we know that I had given just a very brief reading about free expression. Interestingly, the First Amendment of the U.S. Constitution talks about free expression. And obviously, the regulation and censorship of speech is one of the many topics that can come up when we are talking about the internet, but we will revisit this certainly when we talk about journalism as well. So your attendance question. So this will be due Saturday, the 25th. Again, if you need additional time, please let me know. And you're not required to respond to your peers, but you are required to read your peers' responses and my responses in turn. And I am particularly interested in reading your response to this question, which I've deliberately kept broad. What do you think about AI, artificial intelligence, and why? Do watch that video first, The Extraordinary Story of Artificial Intelligence, because that'll give you some background to talk about what AI is and how it's influencing things. And I do recommend, too, that you also watch that 3 minute trailer to give you a little bit more background on AI. And what we will do next time is talk a bit about your responses and our next media vehicle. That said, we also will talk about our journals. So I'll leave you to watch The Extraordinary Story of Artificial Intelligence. Again, remember, it was done in 2018. So this is all old news. And with artificial intelligence, basically anything that's more than a few days old is old news. I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well. And we will continue on next class. Take care. Bye-bye.